contempt was too much.
Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of New Zealand First and particularly my colleague Dennis O'Rourke, who saw most of this bill through the Select Committee process, and I trust that I'll do him justice by taking his slot. Mr Speaker, I want to start by making it very, very clear to the House, and when New Zealand First is not going to go through this election talking about bottom lines, except for this matter. And we wish to make it very, very clear as a party that if any party in this House today debating this bill and voting for it in particular wishes to be in government with us post-23 September, they will have to accept that we will repeal this bill. And I'm saying it again, New Zealand First is making it very, very clear that if this bill passes in this third reading, those parties that vote for it, if they wish to be in government with New Zealand First post-September 2017, better accept this bill will be repealed. Mr Speaker, when New Zealand First spoke to the government, we said we were willing to cooperate on any amendment, any change to the resource legislation, so long as it was aimed at simplification, so long as it was aimed at reducing delays, so long as it was aimed at reducing costs, so long as it was user-friendly, so long as it did adequately provide land for housing, but without compromising the Act. We said that those things would be subject to a number of things, such as our belief and our adherence to the principle of there being one law for all, regardless of race, creed or ethnicity. We said that we would preserve sections 5, 6, I'll get to Marama Fox soon, sir. Preserve sections 5, 6 and 7, but with climate change as a matter of national imperative, subject to preserving district, city and regional council democracy and not undermining that in the same way that this government did in 2013 with the Local Government Amendment Bill. So long as it ensured adequate housing, land for housing without compromising the Act, that no excessive resource and with no excessive resorting to crude executive ministerial powers of the like that this bill now entrenches, especially when it comes to overriding local democracy and the people's view of how the resources within their territories should be used, should be managed, and how development should occur. Those were the fundamentals of the ground that we laid out in an offer to assist this government should it choose to engage with the Right Honourable Winston Peters. But it did not. And where are we now? We're at a situation now where we are watching. One of the other things that we made very clear in this debate along the way is we're going to get rid of the Maori Party through the election process, because people will see through this legislation exactly what they've got. They've got a government that has now been an outrageous situation where this House is by the thinnest skin of majority going to pass legislation because the tail is wagging the mongrel government dog like a lamb. Like a lamb.
No, the member will resume his seat. I just want to warn the member that this is a sensitive debate. It's a debate where there are strongly held views on both sides, but and I say this as a loving owner of dogs, it's not appropriate to describe a government in that way.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for your guidance. And it's interesting that the Speaker should raise the issue.
Order. David Bennett, can you please just try and control yourself, especially using words like that?
You can do it all day.
Ron Mark.
Thank you, sir. And I'm going to take the cue about this being a sensitive debate. And I'm going to make the observation of how bizarre we are. And New Zealand First is often referring in this House to Pepsi Coke governance and Pepsi Coke legislation. And we have another one of these Pepsi Coke moments where Labor Labor is championing against something that we would say, did in the past, and I go back to 2003 and I can go back to 2004, where this very same government railed against them for doing the very same sorts of things. And let me, just for the benefit of the Māori Party, who's so in love with their new friends over that side, just read out a quote. I turn now to some of the loopy provisions that provide for the protection of ancestral landscapes. We, New Zealand First, ACT and National, ask members opposite to tell us what an ancestral landscape is. It goes on to say, I ask members to look at the fiasco of Ngā Whā Prison and the conduct of Ngāpuhi. What will this bill do to remove the brown mail that is going on in New Zealand, whereby Māori organisations object as of right through the process? I am happy to table the documents to confirm that this is going on. This bill will make it worse, and that it is bad for race relations, bad for the environment, bad for the economy, and this bill does absolutely naught in that regard. And I come to the dirty tricks part of the bill. That, Mr. Speaker, was the Honourable Nick Smith, 6th of May 2003, speaking against the Labor government who were ramming through Resource Management Act amendments. That's not, but wait, there's more. 14th of December 2004. When we come to some of the detailed issues, why is it that members opposite are going to amend the Resource Management Act to make Maori iwi authorities into public bodies? That is a revolutionary constitutional change. I am sure Clayton Cosgrove has not been telling his constituents in the Waimakariri that he is off to Parliament saying that Ngāi Tahu is no longer a private body but a public body, and it will have regulatory powers normally restricted to publicly elected bodies, and that is a step, get this, that is a step backwards that takes us further down the road to having two standards of citizenship in this country. Who said that? Nick Smith, the Honourable Nick Smith, in his Pepsi Coke moment of attacking Labor, who was passing similar, in fact, we would say in New Zealand First, the exact same measures into legislation, but he wasn't finished there.
Order. Member will resume his seat. Chris Hipkins will stand, withdraw and apologise.
I withdraw and apologise.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Ron Mark.
Oh, there's more. But wait, there's more. Nor do we see anything in this bill that will enable us to address the huge and growing problem of iwi holding communities to ransom and effectively asking for, wait for it, brown mail. Brown, that's brown mail, not M-A-L-E, this is brown mail, M-A-I-L, in order for the projects to proceed. Mr. Speaker, this is precisely what New Zealand First has been trying to tell the Honourable Nick Smith, the minister who's brought this debacle to the House, and this minister should stand up and withdraw the bill and apologise to the nation, because this minister campaigned on those words of brown mail, of Maori entities being... Look at me, Mr. Smith. I'm trying to help you. Of brown Maori entities being made into public bodies, usurping the rights of the democratic rights of the citizens, the districts, the regions of New Zealand. Mr. Smith, there is a word that nobody is allowed to use in this House, but it is ringing in my ears right now as we sit here in the third reading, waiting for the votes to be passed. And the irony of all of this is that this bill will only get through because the Maori Party is supporting the man who believes that who knows that they're gonna brown mail the rest of Aotearoa. And every development, and every consent, and every opportunity where someone's trying to free up land to build a house, in will come the iwi with a non-mandated, well now a statutory power, assisted by the minister with his new overriding powers to override the objections of Fed farmers, of the Chambers of Commerce and put his weight behind those Māori entities that he is cementing into law. Mr. Speaker, there is a phrase, there is one line that rings in my ear. New Zealand First stands for equality. New Zealand First stands for one nation, for one people, for one law for all. And it is our belief in this Parliament that the fundamental principle of democracy is that we are all created equal in God's eyes, and nothing in legislation will ever change that, no matter how many flip-flops Mr. Nick Smith makes.
Order. I'm going to call Marama Fox, but just make it clear that this is a call which is substitute of the National Party and therefore a 10-minute, not a 5-minute call. Marama Fox.